Okay, welcome to this collaborative event with Science Humanities and Book Talk. I'm Anna Mercer. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for another virtual Book Talk event. We're delighted to welcome the Science Humanities research partner Susan M. Gaines to talk about her novel Accidentals. That will receive a proper introduction in a moment, but in the meantime, yes, do please use the chat function. Tell us where you're listening from. And just to note that you will be able to ask questions and participate in the Q&A at the end of the talks today. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, which you can use to put your questions in. Feel free to put them in at any time. So with Book Talk, we're running virtual events this year. We've already had several events that have been recorded and placed on our YouTube, including events on Shirley Jackson's We've Always Lived in the Castle, Jane Austen's Emma, and Richard Gwynn's The Blue Tent. And we've got even more to come for the spring-summer season, but I'll tell you about those at the end. I just wanted to note that if you want more content on any of the speakers, part of the Book Talk 2020 to 21 season, you can go to the Book Talk blog for more content about their works. I just want to send a thank you out, especially to the Book Talk team who I work with on these programs. That is Colin Bond, Christy Collins, and Emma Wallace, who have been such great support working with me on creating these virtual events this year. But for now, I'm going to hand over to our chair for the evening, which is Professor Martin Willis. So Martin, would you like to start by introducing the event?
Thank you very much, Anna. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's event. I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming you to the joint Science Humanities Cardiff Book Talk with Susan M. Gaines and her novel Accidentals. Science Humanities Initiative is based at Cardiff University, and I co-chair this with my colleagues Keir Waddington and Jamie Castell. And we work very closely with Susan's group in Northern Germany at the Universities of Bremen and Oldenburg, and I'll say a little more about that group when I have a chance to speak for a little longer about the novel. But for now, I want to give you a brief introduction to Susan and her work, and then we're going to dive in to hear some of the novel itself. Susan Gaines, who's joining us tonight, also from Northern Germany, is a poacher turned gamekeeper, or Susan might prefer to call herself a gamekeeper turned poacher, of course. That is, that she was a scientist and is now a novelist. Susan was trained as a chemist and an oceanographer and has been writing since the 1990s. Her first novel, Carbon Dreams, was published in 2001, and Accidentals, her most recent novel, was published last year. What a year to publish a novel, 2020, unforgettable, I think. It continues two key themes that fascinate Susan in all of her work, I'd say. And those are the relation between science and wider human culture on the one hand, and the environment, environmentalism possibly on the other. I'm also really pleased that we've got with us Dr. Frank Haler from Cardiff University School of Biosciences. I'll introduce Frank a little bit later on. First though, we're going to immerse ourselves in Accidentals. And Susan's going to read from the novel for about 10 minutes or so. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you so much, Martin, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Anna, and the Cardiff Book Club Book Talk team. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm just going to read a few pages from Accidentals for those of you who haven't read the book. Let's see, I'm not starting at the beginning, so I'm starting about that far in. So I'm going to give you just a tiny bit of background. Accidentals is the story of a Uruguayan American family. It's about narrated by a young man who's been raised in the US by an Uruguayan mother and an American father. And the book starts out when his mother, he's in his early 20s, kind of at loose ends, and his mother decides to unimmigrate back to Uruguay. She's a little bit of a difficult person, and she talks him into going with her for what he thinks is just a month or two. He's been going back and forth sort of between his ancient grandmother in Montevideo and listening to his mother and his uncle feud about whether to grow rice and cattle or organic vegetables on an abandoned estancia that they've inherited. An estancia, for those of you who don't know, is a ranch, basically. So Gabriel, our main character, has been exploring the estancia, and he's bought himself a field guide to the local birds and started keeping a journal with his sketches. In this scene, he's venturing into a thick bed of head-high or over his head reeds that he's discovered in the swamp that his uncle calls La Tierra Mala, the Badlands. What else do you need to know? Birdwatching and drawing are things that Gabe did as a child and more or less abandoned, but he's become newly intrigued because of the unfamiliarity of both the landscape and the birds that he finds himself in. I think that's all you need. Oh, since this is a first-person narrator and you're looking at and hearing me read, I'm going to cheat and remind you that this isn't a middle-aged woman talking to you, but rather a 22-year-old man. I'm going to read for about 10 minutes, a little under 10 minutes. The reed bed was just the entree to a marsh that was more varied and three-dimensional, more magical and unfathomable than any marsh I'd ever known. I could hear an entire symphony of birds squawking, whistling, and singing, but the reeds were too dense to see anything until, some 100 yards in, I came upon a small open glade. It was so crowded with ducks and strange-looking wading birds, I felt as if I'd stepped into a natural history museum diorama. A golden brown bittern standing in the flooded grass, staring up at the heavens, as if waiting for a meteor to land in a ball of fire on the point of its bill. A chicken-like bird with the most intense purple-blue plumage I'd ever seen, walking like Jesus across the surface of a water lily-covered pond. Two huge pink wading birds feeding in the shadows, stirring the water with bills like large wooden spoons. A pair of reddish-brown ducks floating low near the opposite shore, which was ringed by an impenetrable, half-submerged tangle of brush and trees. Mirasol grande, espaturo rosada, pollona azul, pato fiero. They paid me no heed, and I stayed there watching and drawing the scene for as long as I could bear the mosquitoes. I was making my way back through the reeds when I noticed one lonely, insistent voice in the marsh's evening symphony, a low, hollow-sounding trill, like a bassoon running down a scale and sliding off the end. I paused, and a tiny fist-sized bird ran across the mud near my feet. Some sort of rail, but it disappeared before I got a good look. I tried to follow its calls, and it led me snaking through the reeds until I lost both the route I'd marked and my sense of direction. When I finally found my way out, I was on Caruso's property, and the flooded rice fields were aglow with the first colors of the setting sun, a sea of neon green seedlings floating in orange flames. I climbed an embankment to get my bearings and was surprised to see some familiar characters among the ibis and shorebirds feeding in the fields below. Black-necked stilt, American golden plover, lesser yellowlegs, and, in the next patio over, standing like a lone heron between two tired-looking palm trees, a single representative of Homo sapiens. Young adult female, slight build, thin arms, knobby knees, black hair pulled into a thick ponytail. She had a canvas bag and a bunch of strange contraptions hanging around her neck. What was she doing out there? She set something into the bag and started making her way toward the levee on the other side of the field, where I noticed now there was a car parked. Even wading through the mud with all that awkward equipment, she moved with such an arresting mix of competence and sensuality that I wanted to stand there watching her all day. I forced myself to lower the binoculars. This was, after all, a woman I was looking at, not some exotic species of heron. There wasn't much daylight left, but I knew where I was now. I leapt across the irrigation ditch and started down the levee to the next field. A heron would have been following my every move, watching me through one eye as I neared, preparing its escape. But the woman approached the car and started disentangling herself from her equipment, seemingly oblivious to my presence. I was still trying to decide how to announce myself without startling her when a tero rose from the grass screaming, and she finally looked my way. "Hola," I called, waving and trying to appear unthreatening, though I felt ridiculous with the hysterical tero threatening to dive bomb me. We introduced ourselves politely. Gabriel Haynes, Alejandra Silva, encantado, pleased to meet you. And I thought how absurd it seemed out there in the middle of the empty countryside. And yet it was truer to form than I'd ever imagined such a greeting could be, as I was not only pleased, but quite literally encantado, enchanted, under a spell. The sensation so real, so visceral, it was hard to dismiss, for all that I really wasn't superstitious. Standing there among those rice fields, glorified as they were by the pyrotechnics of a setting sun, I felt an exalted jolt. I felt an electric jolt of exalted fate. She stepped back and looked at my binoculars and my muddy boots, and I looked at her bare legs and equally muddy boots and gestured at the canvas bag she was cradling. What are you doing? We both asked as our gazes met, speaking simultaneously and then waiting simultaneously for each other to reply, and finally laughing. She tossed her head back and chortled with obvious delight, then fished a small jar out of the bag and held it up. I'm collecting samples, she said. Of? Mud and water. She opened the ice chest in the back of the car and deposited the jar inside. A potent brew of microbes, she added theatrically, with earth-shaking consequences for the future of rice farming. She was a microbiologist from the university, she told me, and Caruso had given her permission to do a study on his land. And you? She asked. Did I hear a Yankee accent? Yeah, I'm from California. My mother's Uruguayan and she just moved back. Huh, you moved here from California? No, my mom did, Liliana Quiroga. She and my uncles own the neighboring estancia and she's trying to fix it up. I'm just here for the summer, between jobs. This isn't exactly Uruguay's most popular beach resort, she said, swatting at a mosquito. No, I said, but it's pretty good for watching birds. Is that what you're doing? She reached up to adjust the elastic band in her hair, her slight figure briefly open to view, small-waisted, small-breasted, round-hipped, and entirely self-assured as she released and recaptured the mass of black curls. My exalted sense of fate was fast giving way to the more prosaic vertigo of yearning, and I looked away and started telling her about the rail I'd been chasing. I didn't get a good look at it, I said, but it was acting like a rail, lurking around under the reeds, very secretive, never flying. It has this weird call. I cupped my hands over my mouth and tried to imitate the hollow trill, and then I got self-conscious and fell silent. Usually people glaze over and look for the first escape route when you start talking about birdwatching. I knew this, and yet here I was describing a bird I'd hardly even seen, trying to imitate a call that would have been impossible for even the most adept bird call impersonator, which I wasn't. But Alejandra appeared to be listening attentively. When I broke off, she looked around curiously as if in search of my elusive rail. The crazy Tero was the only avian representative in easy view, so I offered her the binoculars and pointed out the shorebirds in the next field. She was inexperienced, and I had to tell her how to find the birds and focus. But once she got the band of ibis in view, she took her time, watching them feed. They're eating little crabs, she said. Yeah, look a little to the right, behind them, you'll see the shorebirds. I flipped through the field guide for the Spanish names. The one with the really long legs and black neck, I said, is a Tero Real. It seemed a little unfair that the serene and graceful black-necked stilt should share a name with the maniacal Tero Común, but that was it. The squat little ones with the white eyebrows, I said, are Cholo Pampas, and off to the side there is a Pitotoy Chico. Those two are migrants, I added, skimming the field guide entries. They breed in North America and come all the way down here for the winter. Unbelievable, isn't it? Yes, she said, lowering the binoculars and turning to look at me, waiting a beat and smiling. I could feel a blush rising in my face, and I glanced away, watching a group of ducks as they flew in to land on the irrigation canal. So you're an ornithologist, she said. A student? No, it's just a hobby. I learned as a kid from my dad's father. In California, I can identify almost anything on site, sometimes even by call. But my degree was in geography. I didn't want her to think I'd spent my life wandering around aimlessly looking at birds. I do GIS analysis and mapping for an environmental firm. Even though I'd quit the job, I figured it sounded respectable. But it was the birds that had caught her fancy. You know more than I do, she said, and I'm a biologist. She scanned the fields around us as if seeing them in a new light. We're too specialized. Microbiologists, for example. We never pay attention to what's going on up there in the higher echelons of the food chain. You should see the birds in the marsh. I gestured toward the reed bed I'd come out of. It's not easy to get into, but it's absolutely incredible. If you want, I could take you birding there. I'd like that, she said, and then she thanked me and made to leave, as if the offer were hypothetical, a mere courtesy. When? I said quickly. When do you want to go? Fate, I realized, was only going to take me so far. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Susan. That was very evocative of the novel and really captures some of the kind of key elements of it that I want to go on and talk about. So the next two sections of the book talk tonight will be presentations from myself and then from Frank ahead of the Q&A, which I'll set running with Susan, but then invite all of you who are here in the audience to join us and ask questions. The Q&A function at the bottom of your screens is available now for you to put any questions in as they come to you. Now, Susan's novel is part of a wider genre of contemporary writing called the science novel. The science novel has a fairly long history, taking us back to the early 19th century fictions of science, such as Frankenstein, or even further to Swift's Gulliver's Travels and its engagement with the experiments of the Royal Society. The science novel isn't science fiction. Its aim is not to defamiliarize the world or to offer us a vision of the future, good or bad, but rather science novels are in many ways focused on the ordinary, or rather they're focused on the extraordinary that's already lurking within the ordinary, the wonder that forms within the regular, often bureaucratic work of day-to-day science. Susan should know a thing or two about the contemporary science novel beyond her own work, as she's been central to efforts to collate examples and interrogate them as one of the founders and leaders of the Fiction Meets Science group, a research team based at the universities of Bremen and Oldenburg in northern Germany. Now, since 2013, Fiction Meets Science team have investigated the human dimensions of science in fiction and non-fiction writing. They've looked at the role of the science novel in communicating scientific ideas and how fiction can examine the practices of science and the way it relates to issues about comprehension of knowledge and empathy. Separate, really, from the kind of easy didacticism that you can find in popular science writing that's trying to explain to you, for example, the universe and all of its workings. One of the defining principles of the contemporary science novel, as Susan herself wrote in an article for the journal Nature, is that the science novel shows us that science is approachable for those of us outside of its sphere of expertise. The contemporary science novel tries to throw off some of those common shibboleths of science. It shows us that the world of science isn't an elite activity that's separate from the rest of the world, somehow outside or even above what we think of as society and culture. Rather, the contemporary science novel shows us how science is entangled with all of those elements of our human, social, cultural, and emotional lives. And I think we heard some of that in Susan's reading. And as we see in the work of Susan's fellow novelists, in, for example, Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behaviour, which revealed the intricate emotional politics of the biological field study, or perhaps Ian McEwan's novel Solar, which gave us a very dark and comic vision of the entwining of lives that are romantic, scientific, and political in equal measure. Those are the kind of issues that the contemporary science novel is interested in. So it tries to provide the reader with an immersive experience of doing scientific work. It looks at science from the inside, often employing central characters who, like the historic Gulliver from Swift's Gulliver's Travels, is identifiably one of us, the non-expert, an outsider to science, but who finds herself or himself on the inside. I think this is important, and that this contemporary science novel is important too. Our collective experience of the past year has shown all of us how vital it can be to understand the functions of science and to be confident that the knowledge it offers can really only be properly understood within a much wider ecology of competing ideas, desires, and beliefs. And I would imagine that all of us have seen this in relation to the pandemic over the previous 10, 11 months. The science novel, exploring the many dimensions of scientific practices, including how science intersects with competing powerful forces, political, familial, historical, contributes, I think, to building a broader understanding of how we can take a more informed position as citizens of our own nations and globally. Now, Susan offers a slightly different categorization for accidentals from the contemporary science novel. She calls them nerd novels. And she explored this, of course, in the blog that she wrote for this book talk. Now, I'm going to ask Susan a little bit more about the nerd novel later. So a heads up for Susan on my opening questions there. But for those of you who've not read the blog, and why would you not have done that? The nerd novel defines a range of contemporary novels that focuses on a single area in which the author has a depth of knowledge. And Susan cites the Oxford English Dictionary to further define the nerd novel as one that reveals the author to have an unfashionable, obsessive interest in a subject that they pursue to the exclusion of others. So there is a different way of defining the kind of novel that Susan has written. Now, before I go on to talk about the novel in a little detail, I just want to use the power of Zoom to take me to what would be a far better location for doing that. So if you wouldn't mind just giving me a second while I jump down to Heathrow Airport. Just give me a moment to wait for my flight out to Uruguay. I think that I'm likely to be called quite soon. And when I get on, I'm hoping that it won't take me long in this environment to reach there. You should be able to see, I would hope, Montevideo. There we are. There's Montevideo outside of the plane window. And it's early evening here, beautiful early evening. And I'll soon be landing, I would hope, in Montevideo Airport. And here we are. It took me a bit longer than I thought to get through customs, and it's nighttime now. But tomorrow morning, I would hope to be in rural Uruguay on an estancia. And I'm sorry about my pronunciation there, Susan. And here we are. This is a couple of hours north of Montevideo, the beautiful ranch house there. I'll step out of the way for a moment. Whew, it's a little warmer actually here than it was in my office. To turn to the novel then, the narrator, I think, of Accidentals certainly appears to fit the mold of that nerd novel characterization, as well perhaps of the contemporary science novel. Now, our narrator, as Susan has pointed out, is Gabriel, a 20-something American Uruguayan who is, at least to begin with, uninterested in much other than the unique birdwatching opportunities that are offered by his trip with his mother. And in that sense, the novel offers us a character who very much performs the role of the nerd. But there is much more to Gabriel's obsessive birdwatching. His encounters with birds on the estancia or ranch, which his mother is attempting to reclaim from its rewilding, illuminate an engagement with the natural environment that's fundamentally immersive. Gabriel doesn't just look for birds, he enters into the land in order to come closer to them, closer in distance, of course, but also closer in his understanding of them as animals with which he shares the environment around him. Now, as he does this, the reader also learns more about the effects of human activity on this particular environment. We see how the decisions made by farmers going back generations has shifted and changed the estancia's ecology. And Gabriel's immersion in these border regions, the pond and the mud around it, the reeds and so on, that Susan spoke of in her reading, is framed as a kind of microcosm of the Anthropocene, that is, the period of recordable change to environments due to human activity. Now, especially following Gabriel's discovery of the rail in the grasses surrounding the pond's edge and his recognition of it as a bird that's far outside of its normal range and accidental, the novel shows us the complex politics of ecology, the uneasy relations of land management to farming scales to profit and loss that characterizes Uruguayan farming and has implications that are ever larger and which we should see, I think, as as fundamentally global. To drain the pond, to make the land productive and profitable, or to sell it to the neighbouring rice farmer who has certain economies of scale, but to lose the birds in doing so, and to alter the ecology, not knowing the outcome of these changes, to do possibly accidental damage to a fragile ecosystem. These are all the questions that the novel is raising for us, and why it's a fundamentally environmental novel, of course. But the decisions to be made are likely to instantiate other accidentals offers a key to the novel's structure. Now, of course, accidental is employed as a metaphor, consciously so, and it's not just the bird who finds itself beyond its normal range and in an unfamiliar habitat. It's also Gabriel, suddenly uprooted and replanted in Uruguay. And it's also the coincidences of family history and of national politics that emerge alongside the ecology and the science as the novel's other themes. Now, most obvious here is the accidental meeting of Gabriel with the microbiologist Alejandra, and we heard of this in Susan's reading, who, like Gabriel, is immersed in the mud of the estancia to conduct her fieldwork, the collection and study of the mud's microbiome. Alejandra is a genre character that we find in the contemporary science novel. She's a real scientist doing real scientific work, not the kind of heroic genius figure that we might know from historical examples, part Einstein, part Indiana Jones. That's the kind of staple of Michael Crichton's work, let's say. Alejandra's work is pretty dully repetitive, for example, but the novel aims to uncover for the reader the importance of the incremental accumulation of knowledge that this painstaking scientific labour provides. This is the real stuff of discovery that Susan's showing us. Important, I think, is that this is also science taking place in rural Uruguay. Now, that may seem entirely mundane, but for too long, scientific stories, both fictional and possibly in the work of historians too, have centred on Western science, on science from the global north rather than from the global south. And like writers such as Amitav Ghosh, Susan reminds us that the work of science takes place in nations that are too often elided in the stories told thereafter. Accidentals is a really important corrective to the imbalance in scientific storytelling, at least in English traditions, that fails to recognise appropriately the contribution to science from other areas of the globe, for example, from South America. Alejandra's science is not simply enacted in Uruguay. Through her, it's also bound up with the history of Uruguayan politics, emerging eventually as a family story and as a national story. Now, I'm not going to speak of the novel's conclusions in case you haven't finished reading it as yet, but suffice to say that the hidden microbes in the mud find parallels in the hidden history of Alejandra's and Gabriel's families, which are themselves made more complex by their interaction with the totalitarian politics of Uruguay in the 1970s. There is lots going on in Accidentals, as you can see, and as you'll know from reading it. Such entanglements are the métier of the contemporary science novel. And in Accidentals, the entanglements are both visible and invisible. They emerge from multiple forms of knowledge, of family, of country, of love, of DNA, of microbes, farming, and of course, of birds. And in returning to birds and biology, it's definitely the right time for me to hand over to the expert on this, to Frank Haler. Frank, who works at Cardiff University School of Biosciences, he's lecturer there. He's an evolutionary biologist, also a member of the ScienceHumanities initiative, I'm glad to say. And I'm going to hand over now and invite Frank to offer his perspectives from that scientific position on accidentals. Frank.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Good evening, everyone. And also thank you for Susan. What was interesting was that sort of I had thought about what part of the novel would I pick to sort of relate to some of the themes that struck me as particularly interesting. And you already read that. And I'm sure you could read that much better than I could have read any kind of excerpt like that. I don't have a sort of a defined theme that I'd like to focus on. I'll talk you through a few of my sort of thoughts that came up for me when reading the novel and how I feel like it relates to a lot of interesting topics. I don't know how easy this will be through the format of Zoom, but I'm happy to receive questions or comments already while I'm speaking now. I'll try to keep an eye on the questions and answers, but it might also be that other of the panelists might need to help me if I'm missing something. So just to start off with, I sort of got into this more or less by an accident, and I thought it was because of my interest in birds. I've studied birds not as far south as Uruguay, but in North and Central America. I actually study DNA. I study microbiomes. But from sort of my heart, that sort of brought me into this all is that I'm a conservation biologist. And I then discovered, once I'd read the novel, that there's far more parallels that I could ever imagine, which has been really exciting to find. And sort of just to begin with a very odd one, you know, we scientists, we always begin reading something in the acknowledgements, right? You always want to know who's thanking whom. And it turns out there's maybe saying a friend is a stretch, but Santiago Claramunt, who you thank, I know him quite well. We've met at conferences, and I helped him translate a piece of German writing from the early 1900s because he needed his for his PhD thesis at the time. But sort of more interestingly, I mean, I think this sort of identifies me quite firmly in the field of nerd life as well. When reading the novel and then also hearing both Susan and Martin speak about it, sort of highlights to me the parallels of being a researcher and being a nerd, and also being an ornithologist. Sort of a few themes that came to me when reading this, sort of the quote that Susan read, I caught a brief glimpse of a fist-sized bird running across the mud. I assumed it was some sort of rail, but it disappeared before I got a good look. I tried to follow its calls, but it led me snaking through the reeds without revealing itself until I lost both the route I'd marked and my sense of direction. The funny thing is, those sentences capture very well very different aspects that sort of define my daily life. One is they're very firmly rooted of what got me interested in biology, being ornithology. That is exactly how you begin learning about ornithology. You join people who have that existing knowledge that you very well describe in the book, of sort of being able to identify things at first sight and by sound. But as you begin, you cannot identify a single sound. Not at first sight, you'd need to see it well. But the way you sort of learn this is usually standing next to somebody who knows what they're looking at, and they say, oh, you saw that thing? And all you see is a shadow disappearing in the reeds or in the foliage somewhere. So it's very much sort of the entryway to ornithology. But actually, in my daily life, I'm sort of, I like to say 60% researcher, 60% teacher. When we educate biologists here in Cardiff and sort of lead them into the field of research, I feel like it's often very much the same thing. You sort of, you've got a very densely packed curriculum, and you introduce students to a topic, and then they see something briefly, and then it disappears elusively, and you lead them to the next one. And you often feel like you don't have enough time really to introduce it all, just because there's so much. Perhaps sort of more specifically lined up with research, Martin called it the entanglement. Chasing an elusive bird is also how I feel about doing research, and I imagine that others here can relate to that quite well. How you get interested in something and you don't know how deep it'll take you into the subject, and you also have no idea how long you need to stay in this. Is this just a sidetrack, or will it lead you into a few years of research? It's very common that you take a few steps into these alleys that could be promising further avenues of research, or that they turn into blind alleys. And that's very much, I think, captured in the book with the stories of the bird watching as well. What had me laugh out loud very much is the awkward conversations and the making bird sound imitations, and then realizing, oh, that was not how I meant to start that conversation. So this is where it would have been fun to have this conversation in person instead. I'm quite curious about the audience. Are any of you passionate birders? Are any of you bird watchers? If you are, please feel free to put something in the chat. I'm also interested, say that you're perhaps not all bird lovers from the beginning, but let's say you probably don't have an aversion, otherwise you wouldn't be here, I imagine. But sort of, who of you is interested in birds and therefore picked the session? Or vice versa, who's interested in books and thought, well, I'm okay with it, including birds. Those are quite often things when you are a biologist, or I think also a scientist, when you sort of interact with people and they ask you, what do you do? What do you find interesting about something? It's often nice to gauge the audience, because you might find yourself standing in that swamp in Uruguay imitating a bird sound, and then people look back at you like you're from a different planet. So it's definitely sort of a really interesting glimpse and all that. Okay, sounds like we've definitely got a few bird lovers in the audience. A last one I wanted to mention, sort of, you might not realize how slippery the slope is of being a bird watcher. Okay, very amateur bird watchers, lazy garden bird watcher. Okay, great, excellent. So I just wanted to sort of share a story from another planet, if as it were. So as a bird watcher, you might think it's a crazy idea to keep a list. Why would you keep a list of the birds you've seen? And I imagine, sort of, as somebody who doesn't normally think about this or keep a list, you might think, well, you know, you might keep a list of what you've seen in your life. So Susan calls that also a life list. It also leads to other new vocabulary. So a species that you have never seen in your life before is a lifer. So when a bird watcher returns from holidays, you will ask them how it was, and they will tell you 7. And then you go, what? Okay, I saw 7 lifers, so 7 new species. So that's just the beginning. But then you sort of, from your life list and maybe your garden list, then you develop the country specific list and maybe a continent list. Oh, yes, I've seen that bird, but I saw that in North America. I haven't seen it in South America. So that's on a new list. And I think my favorite one was a research colleague in Sweden who was actually English. And he had, I think, the most crazy list I've ever heard about yet. That was the rear view mirror tick list. So he was an absolute liability. I can assure you, I've sat in many crazy car drivers back to the cars, but his car, like, he would literally stop the car and not just look for a bird. That's sort of standard with bird watchers, or they don't stop and just keep driving and looking, and you worry what they'll be doing. But he would actually stop the car, turn it around so that he would get the bird in the rearview mirror. So this is the kind of crazy number of people that you can get exposed to when you dive too deeply into bird watching. And I think your quote, Susan, just to end with that we're too specialized. I mean, sort of, again, I find this touches upon a lot of different aspects of my sort of personal interests, but also my double roles as a researcher and educator of students. The aspect of being so specialized. I think one thing that drives many of the biology students into studying biology are people, you know, that you see on television, you read books by, I mean, I think sort of David Attenborough kind of people who seem to know everything. And then you realize that in biology, as in many other sciences nowadays, it's really difficult to be a generalist, just because the depth of knowledge that we have in so many fields keeps increasing all the time. And it's not any longer enough to sort of know the general things that were enough sort of 100 years ago at Darwin times. If you learn something, you need to go deep. So that sort of balance between being a generalist and a specialist, I think, is again something that you've captured really interestingly here, I think, in that novel, and in how the two of them meet. Martin rightfully pointed out we don't want to talk about the ending, so I had another few reflections on that, but I think that's a very good idea not to discuss. I don't know if there's any questions or comments about this. Otherwise, I think we can move on to the next point.
Thanks very much, Frank. And clearly, I mean, you're right. We've got a number of bird watchers who claim varying levels of expertise here in the chat, who are either aspiring bird feeders, it seems, some of them, amateurs, they call themselves, just started annoying people with it, says someone else. Yeah, absolutely. And all the way through to yourself and Susan, who, of course, we know a great deal about it. We're going to move into Q&A, so that those who want to ask questions, and feel free, if you've got a question for Frank, of course, on this as well, to chip that into the Q&A, and I will bring Frank in on this. I can see several questions in the chat and the Q&A. I'm going to get to them all, but I'm going to start with a question to Susan. And if you were going to join this book talk at this very moment, you would think you'd find the kind of the rudest questioner, because I'm going to ask, Susan, are you a nerd?
Very good. Okay, so I've just been itching to respond to something Frank said, and you gave me the right opening. two openings. The first is Frank said that when he asked how many birders or bird-loving people were in the audience, and he goes, "Well, I guess you wouldn't be here if you hated birds." And actually, I would like to say that that's the whole principle of a nerd novel. The principle of a nerd novel for me, as a reader, is that I can read a novel about something I'm absolutely uninterested in. And that's to me, also the whole joy of a science novel. It's a topic I would never pick up a nonfiction book about. But because it's a novel, because it's a story, it brings me in to a topic that I usually don't care about. And my most gratifying responses that I've heard to accidentals have actually been from people who, for example, during the pandemic, say, well, I never thought to watch birds, but I'm sitting next to my window and I'm just totally now focusing on the hummingbirds that are coming by, and it's changed their whole perspective in the way that they look at birds. So I would push back against the fact that only bird lovers can love this book, I hope. That might have been a little more difficult with my first novel where the nerd knowledge was all about molecules. That was a little harder sell. Am I a nerd? I'm a dilettante, I would say. I think every novelist might say they were a dilettante. So for the many, many years that I was working on this book, I was a nerd. And now I've forgotten it all. So if I were to walk through that marsh now, I wouldn't be able to identify any of those birds, probably. It's kind of like forgetting a language. I did... this will come to actually one of the questions I saw in the chat at some point, but I was a birder as a child. I had an older cousin who was just a marvelous naturalist and very well-known birder in California, who took me under his wing and used to take me all over the state, and that's how I got into birds. And that was actually something that I had abandoned as an adult, as a scientist even. I just didn't have time for. And somebody asked about the genesis of the book, and there are several, but one of the impetus for writing this book was that I wanted to start bird watching again. It's a way of being in nature for me. So I thought, well, how can I do that and have it actually be my work? So that's how the birds got in there.
So the reason I asked you the question, provocatively, of course, was really to ask, one of the things I think that you do so brilliantly with the novel, Susan, is to make us realize how the science is not separate from other things. The science also becomes about family history. The science also becomes about national politics. And in that way, it's not an obsessive focus on one thing. It is what I called an entanglement of things.
Yeah, that's really, so three things going on there. One, I'm just thinking out loud in responding to your question. As a novelist, I should say, when I first started writing about science in my fiction, which I didn't do when I first started learning to write after I had abandoned my scientific career, I had imagined a character who was a scientist, and I couldn't write that character without actually writing the science that she thinks about all the time into the book. It's her life, right? So to me, that's sort of part of the difference between a nerd novel maybe and a science. I mean, there are a lot of science novels that have scientist characters, and they're more about the social structure, sometimes the process of doing science, and you don't necessarily get that much of the knowledge in the book, which is fine. I mean, they're great novels. To me, those two things are inseparable. And the science in these practitioners' life is inseparable from their character. It's inseparable for all the other things going on in their lives. In accidentals, I'm so glad that you focused on this aspect of the novel, because what I was really getting at is this meshing of science and politics, and everything else. I mean, one of the reasons I'm writing about science and fiction, and one of the reasons I think that these books, there has been a surge in what we're calling science novels, in the since the 1990s, I would say, and this is one of the things we've been studying, we've been looking at in Fiction Meets Science. And one of the reasons, of course, is because we just can't. I mean, science, it's one of the most important aspects of the human condition, and we see that ever more acutely, and this year, with the crises of the pandemic and climate change all at once on top of us. I mean, they've been there the climate change has been there for a long time, but we're only now recognizing it, or some people politically recognizing it. And so what I really want to write about in Accidentals, and hopefully I've pulled it off, because there's these stories that sort of converge, and don't seem like they're going to converge at first. And one of the things that's been going on, and Gabriel has become conscious of this, is that for decades these sort of long-term global or large-scale environmental problems, just when we're on the edge of starting to do something about them, say in the 70s, that we're recognizing these problems, something happens that's more immediate politically or more traumatic. So we're just on the edge of, okay, finally we're going to address climate change, and we have a pandemic. Finally, we're going to do something. I mean, in the novel, it's, finally we're starting to think about climate change at that time, and it's 1999, and you get 9/11, and everybody's diverted to more immediate crises. And these either the small scale environmental problems or large scale environmental problems that we can't see the immediate, the risk seems less immediate or less focused on us as humans and more on us as part of a larger network of species. They always get pushed aside. And so that's kind of what's happening in the book with those interwoven themes, I guess.
Absolutely. And this takes us really to Joan's question in the Q&A, and she frames it better than I did in asking, was there one initial germ for the novel? Or was it the larger questions about climate change and species interaction, extinction, amnesia, state-sponsored violence, or was it the personal story of Gabriel and the family? So how would you answer that question about the initial germ for the novel?
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Joan. I actually know her. You could unmute her if we need to hear from her. So I would say, for me, the genesis of a book, writing a book is sort of like making a soup. It's really messy, and it involves a lot of ingredients that you don't recognize when you finish. And when you start out, you don't even know how they relate to each other. So I'd say when I started thinking about this story, and that was way back, this book was like over almost 15 years in the making. I mean, I worked on other things. I actually published a science book in between Echoes of Life. And when I first started thinking about the book and first started imagining it, I was trying to come to terms with the end of nature as I'd understood it growing up in the 1970s. And I had been thinking about climate change, of course, so that was an initial thought in the book. And I was trying to understand an economic system whose well-being depended on perpetual exponential growth. So I thought there would be more of that in there. Some things that Gabriel is also dealing with in the novel. I was trying to comprehend why we weren't doing anything to change it at that time, and why we hadn't. I was thinking about my father's Sierra Club activism when I was a child, and about my own political inertia. So that was one layer. And as I mentioned, the other layer was I wanted to start bird watching again. And let's see, what else? Oh, okay. So that was one body. That was a thematic body that I started thinking about, Joan. And then these concerns merged with some stories that I'd been hearing for decades from one of my dearest friends, who happened to be an Uruguayan immigrant, somebody I studied with, actually, another scientist. And those stories were coming to a head about the time that I was thinking about this novel. So those two things came together, and I started imagining. I didn't want to set a novel in Uruguay when I started the book. I'd never been there. My friend had been trying to get me to go for years. I'd finished Carbon Dreams. It was out in the world, and I was kind of ready to leave California. I kind of thought I was going to set this book in Chile, someplace I had been as a young woman, and where I learned my Spanish. And anyway, as the political stories that my friend was telling me, and the idea, I mean, all my books are a little bit about the concept of altruism and what makes us an activist, what makes us act politically. That was also a big impetus in the book. As those started coming together, and I imagined this whole book in Uruguay, I thought, and my friend talked me into going down with her, everything fell into place. And at that point, of course, I said, I can't write a book in a place I've never lived. So I moved down there. I mean, I felt perfectly at home. I had a whole inherited circle of family and friends. And I kind of like to say I lived this book more than wrote it for all those years. So anyway, that's, I hope that kind of answers. It's not a neat answer to your question, but
no, it is, and it answers a later question that Joan has put in the Q&A as well, around the attachment to place and the evocation of Uruguay, which I agree with her, worked wonderfully. I might just follow on with one more question, and then I'll move on to ask a question from Katerina, because mine is connected to this question of the environment, the place. One thing that strikes me, Susan, and a phrase that kept going through my mind as I was reading the novel, was that you give us essentially two forms of hostile environment. The hostile environment that Gabriel and his mother encounter on the estancia. It's difficult to farm. There are lots of forces against them. And the political environment, which is an obvious phrase to use, hostile environment, about the politics that you are looking at. How does it work for you, this relation between the environment seen as through science and the hostile environment of the politics you discuss in the novel? What's the relation between the two there?
I'm trying to untangle. So there's the contemporary politics that they're directly dealing with. I mean, there's two layers of politics in this novel, actually, and both play out at the family level. So there's the story of what happened during the Uruguayan dictatorship in the 1970s is below the surface of everything that happens in this family, as it is below the surface of pretty much everything that happened, and maybe this has changed since, but in Uruguayan society at the time that I lived there, and between all the relations. So that's one layer of politics. And the other layer of politics is on the surface in Gabriel's contemporary time. And where in Uruguay itself, people like his uncle Juan are trying to find ways for Uruguay to advance economically. And they're looking at their small resources. What can we do? And one of those resources, and this is real, was rice farming. It was one crop that they thought they could make it with, and did to some extent. And it takes its toll on the land. The other politics is inherited from the dictatorship, and that's that the whole region has been drained. I mean, so all the natural wetlands, which the dictatorship was signing into the Ramsar Convention with one hand, in the meantime, were not protected at all, and there were just all these random drainage projects as people converted those lands to rice. So that's what Gabriel and his family have inherited, and it benefited some people and didn't benefit others, and it certainly didn't benefit the birds. So there's these two layers of of things going on. And so the politics in the contemporary scene, of course, influence their decisions about what do we do with this land? And do we just try and make a profit? And in Juan's defense, he's trying to make a profit, but he's also conscious of the larger picture of his nation. And there's also the North-South debate going on, whereas Liliana, Gabriel's mother, who's lived in the US for decades and comes back with all kinds of wacky ideas, or everybody thinks they're wacky, about starting an organic farm. And Juan is like, you can't make any money with this. This is not the way to go. Or when she came back in the 70s, for example, and was going on about recycling while her friends were in prison being tortured. So those conflicts are very much on the page or behind the scenes and playing out at the family level. In the book.
Thank you. That's a really interesting set of answers. Katharina asked a question that is not unrelated to that about things remaining hidden in the novel. Is there anything there you think that remains, as you've said, kind of beneath the surface, that in the book clubs you've been speaking to, in our discussion, in the comments made, that's not been spotted, and you thought, that's interesting. I always intended this to be an element of the novel, but what is there still underneath the mud we've yet to discover in the book, Susan?
Oh, I don't know. You guys will have to tell me. Wait, where's Kat? I'm not sure I understand. So something so something I stuck there that no one's brought up. Is that what we're asking? I don't know. You did a pretty good job of ferreting out the themes. Besides, I mean, we're trying not to talk about the ending, and I don't know among our viewers here how many people have not read or not finished the book, and there's I'll give away the small fact that there's a plot twist, very very in the final 100 pages that we don't want to spoil for you, but the themes come together and I mean there's a whole the whole genetics theme that's running through the book comes through in this section, and we can't quite talk about it, so that's actually one of the things that's kind of hidden, and that actually I discovered working on the book. It wasn't there. I mean, I didn't put it there. It started coming out as the book developed and I got closer to the end and saw what I was doing. So that was a surprise to me. And that's a little bit obscure for the people that haven't finished the book. But
well, I think it's an intriguing entry into the novel to think, what is it that happens that remains so hidden and we then reveal towards the end? Let me go back to the beginning to pose another question, and that is one that John gives us in the Q&A around your choice of a young male narrator. You were conscious at the start, Susan, of saying, here I am, a middle-aged woman narrating this novel here tonight, but you're listening to a young male narrator. Why your choice of Gabriel as narrator?
Oh, two connected answers. I was interested in the mother-son relationship, and when I started the book, I thought it was going to be Liliana's story, actually, and Gabriel's voice. I mean, I hate it when novelists say this, but Gabriel's voice came to me, and I started writing in his voice, and there it was. And at some point, I don't know, I think I was about 100 pages into a really, really early draft. And I was just like, why am I doing this? Why am I making things so hard for myself? I'm not only writing in a country that I didn't grow up in, I'm writing in a 22-year-old's voice, and I'm writing in a male voice. I could at least make it a girl. And so I literally I rewrote everything. I had to gender shift everybody to make that work. So I gender shift everybody and tried rewriting, and it didn't work at all. Gabriel's voice was Gabriel's voice. So I said, okay, that's that. I tried that, and I just accepted that. And I think part of the reason for that is, I mean, people always ask novelists, well, how can you write from this point of view of the other? You know, there's this whole big conversation now also about cultural appropriation, which is very real but gets very messy when we start prohibiting writers from writing from the point of view of people who are not themselves, who are other colors or other classes or other nationalities. And in this case, I know a lot of young men from Gabriel's generation, and had been experiencing their issues, you know, and I've loved a lot of men from that generation. So it was that relationship, mother son, and that point of view that stuck.
Interesting. There is plenty of time for anyone to add any questions to the Q&A.
There's some in the chats.
I've got another a couple in the chat, and then we are free of questions. So now's your chance, I guess. So let me just pose that question that Colin asks in the chat, Susan, around the professional and the amateur. And I think it's a really interesting question, actually, because what we have in the novel are a series of scientific characters. And in the same way that we've got here with us a series of different levels of amateur bird watching, we've got different kinds of people's relations to science in the novel. We have the bird watching of Gabriel. We also have Alejandra's kind of professional or the early professional science. And then we have the professional bird man who arrives later in the novel. What do you think of the contrast between Gabriel and then the professional? Why did you introduce that professional character rather than just leaving it as Gabriel and Alejandra, for example? What did you want to get going there with the relationship between the amateur bird watcher and the professional birdman?
I was playing around. So someone asked about hidden issues or things we hadn't touched on, and actually this is one of them. One of the themes that plays out is the idea of a naturalist in opposition to a scientist, and what that, and I think at some point Alejandra says, what does she say? She says something about how Gabriel's relationship to the birds is different than the scientist. It's not, I mean, Gabriel talks about the 19th century naturalist, and Alejandra compares him to them at some point. And he says, no, I'm just squawking away here. And the analogy is that he's not afraid to be subjective about what he's seeing, about his observation. He's not trying to be objective at all. And so I wanted to bring in that opposition a little bit. That was one thing. And then the other thing was, I was just intrigued with the science, and I wanted to bring in, someone had to figure out who this bird is, right? Someone's got to figure that out. And to do that properly, I needed an ornithologist. And that's actually also where some of the genetic themes started coming in, and I found that interesting, so I threw it in there. So that was part of it.
So there's a kind of movement, isn't there, from the amateur response that involves curiosity, wonder, just a desire to know more, and then the expert perspective, which also includes those aspects, doesn't it? But can bring a different kind of knowledge to bear. That's really interesting. Talking of a different kind of knowledge, Jolene has a really interesting question for Frank, which I'd like to ask. So Frank, I'm going to bring you in here on Jolene's question. Would you recommend a novel like Accidentals to your students? Very difficult to answer this when the author's in the room, isn't it? But is there room for discussions like this in real science teaching?
Susan, you're welcome to keep the hands down. I think the answer is going to be a slightly complicated one. We rarely, in the biosciences, we rarely either have, or you can rephrase that, to take the time, I suppose, to read things that slowly. This is true for not just for novels, but even for whole textbooks, that we tend to sort of, science is changing so rapidly, and the breadth of topics we need to cover is so wide that we tend to have to make a lot of difficult decisions in terms of how much you sort of cover one thing at a time before you have to move on to another one. So I couldn't directly see, in all honesty, myself incorporating this directly into the teaching I do on a more daily basis. It is, however, not uncommon at all that we will recommend reading or sort of talk. It's not, I wouldn't directly call it teaching, but it's more sort of interaction with the students more broadly, where we speak to them about, you know, travels we've done, books we've read, articles we've read, and I think bringing to them a bit more a feeling for where do we draw, like from where do we draw the inspiration and sort of the continued fascination with the topics that we study, really. And I think as a scientist, the day you stop feeling that fascination for your topic is a sad day. Like I think that the thing that drives our curiosity is that continued sense of awe of finding out new things and being inspired by what we see. And so, like, I feel like there are days when we wear the hat of the professionalism and engage a bit more like Eduardo with us and think about things logically and bring the background knowledge. But then I think, sort of just from my personal reflection, what I need in between those days are phases where I sort of don't think so much as a scientist, but more let it all sort of flush over me and be sort of pulled away with it and enjoy it. And this is something that can be, I mean, to be honest, just sort of as a reflection like that, it can be even here sort of in Cardiff, walking around and sort of being pulled into a little microcosm where you observe something and just forget everything around you, and then realize you're standing in the way of a bike. Yeah, but I think also traveling to a new country can sometimes be that way, that you sort of feel when you're in a place where you're what I call biologically illiterate. When you move to a place where you don't know the species, you don't know specifically how this exact ecosystem works, you sort of let all that work on you, and that fascination is really strong. And I think, sort of to come back to your specific question, then what I try to sort of give my students is a sense for where do we as researchers and teachers draw upon that kind of fascination and continued motivation. And that will then be kinds of stories like these. What do we read? Where do we go? What do we do? And I can definitely see myself sort of pointing students to this novel if they're interested in these angles. I mean, I definitely see that it's interesting also because, I mean, in my teaching, I didn't mention this much in my introduction, I do a lot of genetics as a tool to understand species biology. And so there's a lot of interesting parallels here that would, I think, be interesting to students.
Fantastic, thank you.
Can I add to that a little bit?
Please,
of
Susan,
course, yeah. So Frank, and Jolene, I just wanted to say one thing, because I hear about these things as a novelist that writes these things, books. And one thing we started in Fiction Meets Science in the program I run in Bremen, just sort of on the side, we have a couple of scientist book clubs. So these are researchers from, and it's across generations. So from they're not undergrads, they're PhD students to emeritus. There's, a small group, just a book club. There's one at each university who get together, and they only do it 2 or 3 times a year. They read 2 or 3 novels a year. They love these science novels, and then they get together with a lot of wine and cheese and talk about them. And what they get out of that, and even if it's not from their particular field of study, is that the novels explore all the political and social paraphernalia of science. So we always have these conversations. There'll always be someone who's an expert in the field of the novel who will say, well, that's not realistic, or that's really realistic and I don't care, or whatever. But we also talk a lot about things that you don't usually get to talk about in the lab, like the ethics of what you're doing or mispractice and those kinds of things. So in that sense, the books can be valuable as a sort of side thing. And the other place where I've seen them used in teaching is not actually in science classes, but in undergraduate general science and general education courses, where Carbon Dreams, for example, has been used for years, even though it's out of print, by people trying to bring students to think about all the issues around climate change. And so those are a couple of ways that I've seen them used.
Yeah. Catherine asked a question that's kind of related to that, Susan, and that is, you obviously moved careers from your work in the 90s as a scientist to now being a scholar of fictions of science and writing fiction. Was there an element of moving out of science and into a creative art in your decision for that transition? What elements were there that are related to what we've just been talking about in your movement between one and the other?
Actually, I got into science as an accident, actually, to begin with. I mean, I'd always been writing and reading, and that was kind of where I would have gone, but I never imagined, you don't imagine, at least when I was a young person, you didn't study creative writing. It wasn't a thing to do. And when I was in university, I fell in love with chemistry. Basically, I'm actually writing an essay about this right now. I'm writing a fiction meets science personal essay for the first time. So when I dropped out of science, the decision was very much what you were talking about, Martin. Or no, what Frank was talking. Well, one of you was talking about, Frank. This problem of specialization, that once you're in the work, especially as a graduate student, you all the big thinking that you were so happy and so looking forward to disappears, and you don't have time for anything but those 80 hours a week in the lab on your little tiny piece of the story, and you lose track of the big picture. So I just realized I had time for nothing else. I wasn't one of those brilliant people that could do everything. And I said, okay, I'm going to stop doing this and read and write. And of course, it was a crazy decision. I spent many years, just so the creative writers out there, and I shouldn't say this, but I spent many years doing the classical starving writer thing, living very hand to mouth with all kinds of weird day jobs. But it gave me an intellectual freedom that I didn't feel I had as a scientist. And as I discovered quite by accident, and when I started writing about science, I have the freedom to think broadly, think big, and read broadly about the sciences I'm interested in for the background for these novels.
Yeah. Continuing that theme in a way, Anna asks what is a really interesting question about the aesthetics of bird watching. It seems to be an activity of beauty. Did you think of including illustrations at any point? Obviously, you write about the potential for illustrating these birds. Gabriel is himself an excellent bird illustrator, isn't he? Or is that something you wanted to remain part of the imagination?
The quick answer is the latter. I wanted to do it in words. I wanted you to have it in your head. That said, so this whole in the blog we put this list of the birds that are in accidentals, which I created after the fact because readers, actually one of these book clubs that I spoke to, well, a couple of them, I was surprised to find that people were actually, and these weren't necessarily bird people, they were actually going and looking up every single bird because they wanted to see what they looked like. And at first I was slightly disappointed because I thought, well, I described it. And then I was honored that they were so into it, you know. And so one of them said, do you have a list of the birds? And I said, well, no. And then she said, well, can you make us one? And then I thought, okay. And then I thought, oh, this is kind of cool. So I linked, that's another sort of, if I think about nerd novels, that's another one of the beauties of nerd novels, is that you get sucked into something that you don't know you're interested in. You're not going to be tested on it. So you learn a little bit, you know, it's a novel. Hopefully that's the fuzzy line, especially with science. You know, it's a novel. So you don't say, okay, this is fact. It gives you a sense of the knowledge. And if you're really interested, nowadays, it's pretty easy. You go to Wikipedia, you go to the encyclopedia, you get a nonfiction book, and you read more. So in that sense, it's gratifying that people can click on the birds and read all about their life histories on eBird. Was that? Oh, so and in terms of illustrations, yeah, no, I mean, I did at one point think that it would Santiago Claramunt, who I met very early on in Uruguay, and I didn't spend much time with him then. I was really early in my research, and he was still was he even a grad student? He was, yeah. Anyway, later I saw some of the drawings he did in his notebooks. Actually, I used, and I said, "Oh, this is exactly like what I imagined in the novel." I mean, I hadn't seen them before, and I would have loved to put some of those sketches just as chapter images or something, but of course this would all cost too much. And by the way, the publisher is a nonprofit environmental publisher in the U.S., so goes to a good cause, but they don't have funding for that kind of stuff. Somebody asked, while we're on that, let me just answer. Somebody asked about a Spanish translation in the chat. Yeah. No, it's not yet. My agents, they're working on selling the Spanish rights, but it's hard partly because of the pandemic. So there was a whole year the book came out, and at the time when one should be doing all this stuff, no one was paying attention to anything, and sales haven't been good. So that also determines whether she can place the Spanish rights. So I'm actually having a conversation with her tomorrow, and I know they were working on the German rights, and so far those haven't sold. So it could be, I hope, if they don't sell the Spanish rights, I may actually we may actually just try and find someone in Uruguay, a small press in Uruguay, to do it. But
good to know. Thank you for answering that, Susan. There's one question left, and it's focused on an idea of endings, so it might be the appropriate question for us to be rounding up on. And that is Joan asking about whether you've changed your own point of view on the end of nature. Now, you'd have to share with us what your point of view on the end of nature is, and whether or not writing the novel altered your views about whether nature is potentially coming to an end, and what that means to you.
Yeah. Writing the novel, I mean, I kind of lived Gabe's changing ideas. It was more an acceptance that I was working towards. No, I haven't changed my idea in the sense, I mean, to me, nature ended when we changed our atmosphere. Or my concept of nature, my concept of wild places. And so this coming into acceptance about the need to manage nature. And this is, again, that shift from the classical environmentalism that I grew up with, and that is kind of very much of one's being as a Californian who grew up in the mountains and along the wild coastlines of the New World, we could say, of the West. So that coming into, now more so, I would say more so every year, there's a sort of grief that goes along with that, and a letting go. And I gave that to a younger generation. So he had sort of, Gabriel is kind of a dinosaur. I mean, he's inherited his grandfather's perspective on these issues, and grown up with that, and had himself to let go of it. I mean, there's this whole part of the contemporary politics of the novel where he's watching his friends in the Seattle protests, and thinking, oh, I should be on the street, and God knows what he would have thought now, and not having enough hope to be an activist, not having enough hope to try and change things. And by the end of the novel, I mean, without giving away too much of the ending, by the end of the novel, he's accepted it basically to be trite. You do what you can do. You do what you can do.
Yeah. And in a way, this is a question that Katrina poses, but it's connected, I think, and that is, were you always considering accidentals as the title? Did that emerge through the writing process, or did you was that always there? And what, it seems related, doesn't it, to questions about cause and effect, as well as, of course, metaphorically more broadly. When did accidentals become the title you settled on?
Very, very late. The titles are a funny thing. I mean, my first two books, including the novel in the graveyard of unpublished first novels, had titles very early on. Carbon Dreams was like driven by its title. This book didn't. So there were lists of titles floating around while I was working on the book. And when I finally finished the penultimate draft, enough to send to my agent, I had narrowed that down. And at that point, how did I come up with? At that point, it had 2 titles. Should I even tell you the old title? You want to know the old title?
Well, I do.
So, wait, I have to remember it. So there's 2 kinds of titles. I don't know, contemporary. You see these really long titles, right? Or you see these really short, punchy titles. So the really long title was The Last Naturalist and the Terrorist's Daughter. So when I sent to my agent, I gave her that choice or Accidentals, which I came up with, I think, when I was on a visit to my sister and brother-in-law in the US, and I was still throwing around ideas, and I threw it on the table with my brother and my brother-in-law. I like that one. And then I started thinking about it, because when I first started thinking about it, all the different, I mean, that's another thing that emerged also in the final revisions, the many different metaphoric uses of that word, which was very, and so we said, and my agent immediately said, oh, I like that one. So we settled on that.
Terrific. Now, I think what we'll end on is...
Wait. There's one thing we have to answer. I'm sorry. There's someone in Montevideo with a birthday.
Well, I think it's a comment.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Never mind. Okay. Sorry. I just wanted to make sure we did. Okay.
Claudia, hoping for the Spanish edition, which we all hope for. We'll close with Prabhu's question. There's no simplistic questions here, Prabhu. I think it's really interesting to be able to answer that. Frank's already typing an answer about his favorite bird, so we'll see that appear in the Q&A, I hope. And that's a question for you as well, Susan. Always nice to take pleasure in the natural world, isn't it? So we can do that here. So, Susan, what is your favorite bird?
Oh, it changes daily.
What's it today then?
Okay, the dilettante. So here's an interesting thing. I just started learning the birds of Europe. I mean, so I wrote, like I said, the novelist, you do all this stuff and then you forget it all. So I literally hadn't been birding in like since way before I finished the draft of this novel. But black rail.
Great.
Which, of course, that's a no-brainer because it was I like the most secretive dull little guys, hidden away.
I'd be disappointed were it another bird than the rail, Susan. I would. Frank.
What's Frank?
Yeah, I decided not to type, but rather to say it instead. That feels more personal. That's a really difficult one. I mean, I wouldn't be an ornithologist if I didn't love a very large number of them. And I think also it does shift sort of as I shift in my research to different things. But if I have to pick one, and that was your question, I think I'll have to go back to the one I studied for my PhD, which was the white-tailed eagle. So that's the biggest European eagle. Went extinct on the British Isles in the early 1900s, but is currently being reintroduced to a number of locations. A population has been established in Scotland. A population in Ireland is just sort of about to cling on, and now they've been introduced to the Isle of Wight. And we're sort of watching them reclaim that land essentially. And they can sort of, what I find interesting for them is that they're a bit of a shapeshifter. When you see them sitting, they can be attacked by crows and seagulls and other animals. And they just sit there like a rock in the rain and barely move. And you don't realize how big they are until they spread the wings. And like I said, they're the biggest European eagle. So they can be 2.50 meter wingspan, an adult female. So the females get bigger than the males. And so 2.50 meter wide. And when you see them taking off, they're such a majestic animal. But then again, then you hear their vocalization. And I mean, they're the smallest birds that have the most fantastic voices. A sea eagle, I am not going to try this, even if Susan has a hilarious description of ornithologists imitating bird vocalizations. If you're interested in it, please do Google it. White-tailed eagles have a clucking, shrieking noise that is completely unfit the largest European eagle, and you just wonder, why didn't you pick something that was more fun than that? But I think sort of for them, I remember much of my thesis work was on how they survived a near extinction event and then came back. And I remember in my final days before handing in my PhD thesis, I found a quote by the music band The Eagles, who said, "We never quit. We just took and I forget the exact number, we just took a 15-year-long break," or something like that. And that ended up being then what I ended up using as a title for a chapter from my thesis as well. So I think those are still closest to my heart.
Thank you very much, Frank. We are running out of time, so it's important that I thank Frank for the fantastic talk he's given, and especially to Susan for the reading and answering all of those questions, Susan, and hearing more about the novel has been a fantastic experience for me this evening, and I hope for all of you listening and viewing us at home as well. Let me pass back to Anna to round us off for tonight.
Thank you, Martin. And thank you to all our panelists this evening. Thank you to Martin, Frank Haler, and especially Susan M. Gaines tonight for being part of this panel. So much to think about. And I can see people in the chat saying they're really inspired to pick up the novel if they haven't already, which is just really excellent. And what a great set of questions. Thank you to everyone who contributed. There are some links in the chat to our blog, which Susan also very kindly contributed to ahead of the event. So you can still go and find those posts if you wish. She talks about the nerd novel and all the birds, of course. If you can't find them in the chat right now, do just go to cardiffbooktalk.org, and you can look at Susan's posts there. Thank you also to Martin and Frank for your perspectives tonight from your different fields. That was really interesting. Attendees should look out for an email with a feedback survey following tonight, and we will share the recording of this event shortly too. I just want to take a quick moment to plug our next Book Talk event, which is on the 3rd of March, so pretty soon, and that is Octavia Butler's Kindred. Kindred, if you don't know the novel, tells the story of Dana, a young Black woman who is transported from her home in 1970s California to the pre-Civil War South. So we have 3 expert speakers coming to talk about their research on Octavia Butler on the 3rd of March. Again, it's free, it's online, we'd love to see you there. Do go to our website to find the booking link for that. Looking further ahead, there's still plenty more Book Talk events coming up in 2021. We will be looking at Anne Quinn's Passages, one of the novel events later coming up in the year. There'll also be an author-led event on Tyler Keevill's book, Your Still Beating Heart. And we'll also be reading and chatting about Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light, as well as Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse in the summer. Thank you again to all our excellent panelists. Virtual round of applause, I'm sure we're all trying to do. And thank you for your questions, everyone, too. Good night.